The Midnight Tapper. I never believed in monsters. Growing up, stories of shadowy figures in the night or creatures lurking under the bed had never held much sway over me. Even as a child, I was quick to dismiss the whispered warnings of others as figments of imagination. Tall tales meant to frighten, not to believe. But as I sit here now, trembling hands gripping this pen, I can't deny what I know. I've heard it, I've seen it, and I felt it creeping closer. It began on a Tuesday night. I remember because it was one of those oppressive, heavy evenings where the air feels wrong. Too still, too thick, like the world itself is holding its breath. I live alone in a small house perched on the outskirts of town, hemmed in by thick woods that whisper when the wind moves through them. Most days, I loved the solitude, the quiet that allowed my mind to wander as I rode into the small hours of the night. But that night, the quiet was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. It was close to 3 a.m. when I first heard it. The unmistakable sound of tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, deliberate. 3 quick raps against the glass of the window in my study. I paused, the pen freezing mid-sentence as the sound carried through the dark room. My heart skipped, but I quickly shook it off. Probably just a branch, I told myself. I'm surrounded by trees. It wouldn't be the first time the wind had caused such noises. Tap, tap, tap. It came again, and this time I knew it wasn't the wind. The rhythm was too precise, too calculated, as if someone, or something, was waiting for me to notice. My skin prickled with unease as I turned to face the window. The curtains were drawn, but the sound seemed to crawl through the glass and into my ears. I hesitated, then forced a chuckle into the empty room. "It's nothing," I muttered under my breath, though the words felt hollow. Probably just a raccoon. I reached for the curtains, my fingers brushing against the fabric. I don't know why I hesitated, but something deep inside me screamed, "Don't look." Tap, tap, tap. The sound was louder now, more insistent, and my resolve faltered. I yanked the curtains open, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there. The window faced the backyard, a steep drop that sloped down into the woods. No trees or branches came close enough to touch the glass. I pressed my hand against the cold pane and peered outside, but the night was thick with darkness. My porch light barely reached the tree line, and beyond it was a vast, impenetrable black. There was no wind, no movement, just silence. And yet, I felt watched. Strange how the mind works. Even when confronted with something inexplicable, it fights to make sense of things. It was late, I reasoned. I was tired, overworked. I'd probably imagined the tapping, or maybe some animal had scurried up against the glass. With a final glance at the empty backyard, I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep. Hours passed, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house setting me on edge. The silence seemed unnatural now, too heavy, too expectant. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. I finally drifted off sometime after 4 a.m., but my sleep was fitful, haunted by dreams I couldn't quite recall. When I awoke the next morning, I felt drained, like I hadn't slept at all. I tried to put the events of the night behind me, but when I entered my study, I froze. There, on the window pane, were marks. 3 faint streaks, perfectly parallel, as though something sharp had grazed the glass. The days that followed were uneventful, but the nights were a different story. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., the tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. I'd sit frozen at my desk, the soft knocks filling the room like a creeping infection. I refused to open the curtains again. Once had been enough, and some primal part of me warned that whatever was out there was waiting for me to acknowledge it. If I looked again, it might not leave. By the 5th night, I was coming apart at the seams. The tapping had begun to sound closer, heavier. like something large pressing against the glass. My exhaustion was mounting, and my nerves were fraying under the weight of that insistent sound. I knew I needed answers. It was an old man at the local hardware store who first mentioned the woods. "You live out on Hollow Ridge?" he asked, narrowing his eyes as I purchased some blackout curtains. "Near the tree line?" I nodded cautiously. He grunted, shaking his head. "You ever hear of the Midnight Tapper?" My blood ran cold. "What did you say?" "The Tapper," he said again, voice low. "Old legend around these parts. Something that knocks at windows in the dead of night. Always 3 times. Always at 3 a.m. "What happens if you hear it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The man's lips twitched, like he didn't want to answer. "You don't open the window," he finally said. "You don't look. And whatever you do, don't speak to it. Folks say it marks those who do. Leaves them with scars. And if you ignore it long enough, well..." He trailed off, and I pressed him. "What?" "They say it comes inside." I left the store feeling sick, his words a poison worming through my brain. I tried to tell myself it was just a story, an old folktale passed around to scare people. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, something that knew I'd seen it. That night the taps came louder than ever. Tap, tap, tap. I sat paralyzed in my chair, staring at the closed curtains, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. But then, it changed. From outside the window came the faintest sound of whispering, low, guttural words I couldn't understand. The voice was right against the glass, so close I could feel the chill of it in my bones. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed outside, the door slamming behind me. My breath clouded in the freezing air as I marched toward the woods, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Who's out here?" I shouted, but my voice sounded small against the vast quiet. The woods were deathly still. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. I moved further in, stumbling over roots and frozen ground. That's when I saw them. Marks on the trees. 3 scratches, deep and jagged, gouged into the bark like claw marks. They were fresh, the wood around them raw and splintered. I ran my fingers over the grooves, a cold realization settling into my gut. Something had been here, something big. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap. Not at my window this time, but from somewhere deeper in the woods. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hands. The tapping echoed again, closer now, impossibly heavy, like bones striking wood. My heart thundered as I backed away, tripping over roots, the beam swinging wildly. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shape, tall and thin, just at the edge of the light. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted as though watching me. And then it moved, straight toward me. I ran. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. After my frantic run from the woods, I barricaded myself inside the house. Every window was locked, every door bolted. The blackout curtains I'd purchased hung heavy, sealing out the world beyond. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. The night after the encounter in the woods, I sat in my study, trembling at my desk as the clock inched toward 3 a.m. I'd stopped writing days ago, my creativity smothered under a suffocating layer of fear. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood settling in the dark. I glanced nervously at the window, the blackout curtains pooling on the floor like a black ocean. 3 a.m. it began. Tap. 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 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, echoing in the stillness. My stomach turned. I gripped the arms of my chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I wouldn't look this time. I wouldn't. The taps grew louder. Tap. 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 Each knock rattled the window pane, impossibly strong, as though something massive was just on the other side. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear it now. Something breathing. A slow, shallow inhale followed by an exhale so deep it sent a chill through me. And then, for the first time, it spoke. A whisper slid through the glass, slithering into my ears like cold oil. "Let me in." The voice wasn't human. It was guttural and ragged, like broken glass scraping against stone. The words came slowly, deliberately, each syllable dragging out like a knife being pulled across my skin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The room felt heavy, suffocating, as if the air had been replaced with something dense and wrong. "Let me in," the whispering repeated, more insistent now. I dug my nails into the desk, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Every fiber of my being told me not to answer, not to acknowledge it. And then came the sound that nearly stopped my heart. The window latch clicked. My eyes shot open, terror flooding through me. I turned slowly toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. The latch, locked just hours ago, was now undone. I could see the faintest sliver of darkness where the window had cracked open, as if something had pried it loose. I stumbled to my feet, my legs like jelly as I grabbed the window with trembling hands and forced it shut. I threw the lock back into place and yanked the curtains tighter, stepping away as though the glass might explode at any moment. And then I froze, the breathing. It wasn't outside anymore. It was behind me. My blood ran cold. I turned my head, the motion slow and mechanical, like my body didn't want me to look. From the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shape standing in the doorway of my study. At first, it was little more than a silhouette, tall and impossibly thin. Its arms hung down in unnatural lengths, the fingers, long and claw-like, brushing against the floor. Its head tilted slightly as if it were watching me with great interest. I couldn't see its face. The shadow swallowed its features, but I could feel its eyes, the weight of its stare pressing into my chest like a stone. "Let me in," it whispered again, though its voice now came from all directions, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I backed away slowly, my feet unsteady beneath me. My mind screamed at me to run. But where? It was inside now. There was nowhere to go. The figure took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though its body didn't quite understand how to function. Each step made the wood creak beneath its weight, the sound sending fresh waves of terror through me. I stumbled backward, bumping into my desk and sending papers scattering across the floor. My hands scrambled for something, anything to use as a weapon, but there was nothing. My breathing came in short, ragged gasps as the figure crept closer, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the room. "Don't look at it," I whispered to myself, remembering the warning. "Don't look. Don't look." I turned my gaze to the floor, clutching the edge of the desk to steady myself. The figure moved closer still. I could hear the slow scrape of its claws across the wooden floorboards, feel the chill radiating off its body like an open grave. "Let me in." The words were right beside me now, so close I could feel the cold breath against my ear. My body trembled violently, but I kept my gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't dare look. I didn't dare speak. The silence stretched, heavy and endless. For a moment I thought I'd won, and then I felt it. A hand, ice cold and clawed, gripped my shoulder. I screamed. The sound echoed through the house as I threw myself backward, tumbling over the chair and landing hard on the floor. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving, my mind a tangle of panic and adrenaline. The figure was gone. The study was empty. I stood there, trembling and gasping for air, my gaze darting around the room. The window was still locked, the curtains drawn. The doorway was empty, the hallway beyond swallowed in darkness. Had I imagined it? No. My shoulder burned where the thing had touched me, the skin raw and red, as though marked by frostbite. This was no hallucination. It was real, and it had been inside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the corner of my bedroom, Every light in the house turned on. I stared at the doorway, half expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. My shoulder throbbed dully, a constant reminder of its touch. By morning, I knew I needed help. Whatever was happening was beyond me, beyond reason. I drove into town, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and found myself outside the house of Margaret Reed, the town's oldest resident and rumored folklorist. She answered the door after a few minutes, her gaze sharp and suspicious. "You look like Death, boy," she said, ushering me inside. I told her everything. The tapping, the whispers, the figure inside my house. Margaret listened in silence, her face pale and pinched. When I finished, she stood abruptly and disappeared into another room, returning with an old, leather-bound book. "You've heard of the Midnight Tapper," she said grimly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat dry. "It's older than this town," Margaret continued. "Older than most things that walk this earth. It knocks 3 times at 3 a.m., testing the strength of the walls, the locks, the people inside. It marks those who look, those who speak to it. And once it gets inside, it doesn't leave until it's finished." "Finished?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Margaret's gaze darkened. "Until it takes you." My blood ran cold. "How do I stop it?" "There are rules," she said. "Do not open the window. Do not acknowledge the knocks. Do not look at it. And if it gets inside, no matter what you hear, no matter what you feel, do not look at it directly." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It feeds on fear, boy. The more you give it, the stronger it gets. Survive one final night without giving in, and you might drive it away." "Might," I repeated, my voice trembling. Margaret didn't answer. She only handed me the book and muttered, "Pray you're strong enough." That night, I sat alone in my locked house, the book open on my lap. I whispered those rules over and over like a prayer, bracing for what was coming, because I knew it would come. And this time, it wouldn't stop at knocking. That final night felt like the longest of my life. I sat in the living room, every light blazing as if it could hold the darkness at bay. The house, my house, felt foreign now, a husk of what it had been. The shadows stretched longer, the air colder, and the weight of it, of its presence, pressed in from all sides. My breath misted in front of me, though the thermostat read 70 degrees. I clutched Margaret's book like a lifeline, my shaking hands tracing the edges of the yellowed pages as if the words could shield me. I had memorized the rules. Do not look, do not speak, do not let it win. The clock on the wall read 2:57 a.m. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited. At exactly 3 a.m., it began. Tap, tap, tap. The knocks came from the living room window. Soft at first, polite almost. 3 deliberate raps. My heart hammered against my ribs, every muscle in my body screaming for me to flee. But there was nowhere to run. I stayed frozen in my chair, staring at the floor, breathing through my nose in sharp, shallow bursts. Tap, tap, tap. The knocks grew louder, vibrating through the glass. Then came the whispering, low and guttural, the words slithering like maggots into my ears. I couldn't understand the language, but the cadence alone made my skin crawl. It's testing me, I thought. It wants me to look. I clutched the book tighter, forcing myself to focus on the rules. Don't look. Don't speak. Don't acknowledge it. The whispers ceased. The quiet that followed was worse, heavy and unnatural, a vacuum sucking the life out of the room. My ears rang with the absence of sound, and I realized with a jolt of horror that the taps had moved. They were inside. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the wall behind me, then the ceiling, then the door to the kitchen, the knocks moving faster now, circling me. The rhythm was wrong, erratic, no longer a simple 3 taps, but a chaotic scratching, knocking, scraping, like claws dragging along wood. I stared at the floor, refusing to look up, even as the noise surrounded me. My chest tightened as cold air brushed the back of my neck, so close it felt as though something was breathing on me. Then, a slow creak, the sound of the door to the hallway opening. It's here. The air grew colder still, freezing my lungs as I inhaled. I kept my gaze on the floor, tears welling in my eyes as footsteps, slow and heavy, moved across the room. I could hear the floorboards groan under its weight, inching closer. The book slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud, but I didn't dare move to pick it up. The thing stopped just feet away from me. I could feel it standing there, watching, waiting. Its presence was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest like a slab of stone. The smell of earth and decay filled my nostrils, and I fought the urge to gag. It leaned closer. A voice, impossibly deep and sharp, whispered from above me. "Look at me." The words oozed with malice, a sound that made my skin prickle and my teeth ache. I bit my lip hard, drawing blood as I clamped my hands over my ears. I wouldn't look. I couldn't look. Look. At me. The whisper turned to a roar, shaking the walls, rattling the furniture. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. My resolve wavered. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to look. And then I heard it. Tap. 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 The sound came from inches in front of my face, 3 deliberate knocks on the air itself. My breath caught, my vision swim.